Welcome. We're back in session with your host Jay of What's Going On, a Social Studies Network podcast. Now let's get into it. Okay, welcome back to another episode of What's Going On, a Social Studies Network podcast. Today we have...
I'm Emily Chyba. I'm the art teacher for pre-K through 3 at, preschool through 3rd grade, I should say, at Bouchet International School.
How are you feeling? It's after school. You deal with the kids and the babies all day. So what are you feeling like right now?
Well, it's been a bit of a long year, but I'm pretty ready to, I'm pretty ready for it to be done. And you can tell that in the kids too. I think they're like ready, like they're ready to move, especially in the littler kids.
Yeah.
You can tell like the preschoolers are a little bit too old for their building now. They're ready for kindergarten, that kind of thing. So I think we're all sort of ready to be finished.
Everyone is always talking about the senioritis, but no one talks about that
The little ones,
pre-K-itis.
like they are ready to go.
Yeah, they get, I've just watching my niece because she's in pre-K right now. It's interesting seeing the way that she's been navigating throughout
all the
time
changes
of
that
the
they've
year.
made, over the year.
So tell us a little bit about yourself.
About in professionally, how I do like here professionally or just in general?
Whatever. Tell the people. I'm nosy. I want to know anything.
Well, I'm a let me see. So I'm a alumni of University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Also, yep, I got my degree in art history from U of I in the Fine and Applied Arts College. And then I went back for my master's in education. So so and then they were in 2012, they were looking for an art teacher and my name came up in the big pool. And so that's how, because I'm endorsed in art from that art history degree.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm endorsed to teach art and social studies actually. So so I can do both. So that's pretty much, I live here in Chicago. I've got 2 children, both in the Chicago public school system, and my daughter's actually here in pre-K.
Oh.
Yep. So yeah, that's pretty much it about me.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm terrible talking about myself. It's
You know what?
pretty bad at that.
Absolutely understand.
Yeah.
I hate talking about myself,
Right.
but I love being nosy and hearing
asking
other people talk about themselves. Like, tell me all your business. I want to know what it is.
I love it.
But the first question that I like to ask everyone who comes on is, what did you think about social studies before your position now? And what do you think about social studies within your position now?
Oh, well, I actually have loved social studies my whole life.
Okay.
I actually have intense memories of what was that? The Time Readers, those like little Time Reader magazines that you used to get as a kid and everything. Like I read about everything under the sun when I was a kid, like history wise and stuff like that. I probably more the history than like the social studies when you're a kid, because the social studies sort of talks about like your own community and stuff as well when you're little. But my dad, like on vacations, we went to like Civil War battlefields. Those were on vacation. So you'll usually see me at home, like I'll be cleaning and usually I'm watching a documentary of some sort. This year it's been pretty heavy on Pompeii and ancient Rome because of the Pompeii exhibit at the Museum of Science and Industry coming.
Cool.
Yeah. So I've been doing a lot. But I'll watch like all sorts of historical documentaries and stuff.
That's my grandpa.
Yeah. So actually, before I got my art position, I actually was applying more for social studies positions because I think I'm endorsed to teach it through middle school. So I was actually applying more for those than for art, even though I was endorsed in both, because I've just always loved like teaching about history and, fun fact about different stuff. Yeah. So, and that's actually why I went into art history also, is I just loved the like historical, the reasons for why artists made what they, what they made, what was happening in their world at the time. I just loved that stuff. Yeah.
Okay, that's very interesting because
Hmm.
when I got introduced to what you were doing, I'm like, okay, art teacher. And I'm like,
Yeah.
art history. I think that's
Yep.
super dope because I remember like in one of my classes
Hmm.
that I was taking this semester, we were talking about history in reference to art because a lot of the times we look at art and it's like, oh,
Yeah.
it's beautiful. And the only history is, that it was created in this time
Hmm.
by this person for this reason. But we
Right.
never go into what was the cultural impact?
Yeah.
What was the social impact?
What was
How does
happening?
it impact art now? Like,
Hmm.
and I think that's really cool. So
Yeah.
first, obviously I'm going to get into the history because I think again
Hmm.
that's super dope. But
Hmm.
I first want to ask, what is art in your class and how do you think your students would define art? Because you have a pretty special
Yeah.
group, pre-K through
Yeah,
third
I've got
grade.
the little ones.
Yeah.
It is mostly in my class, it's a lot of those fine motor skills is
Hmm.
basically what we're focusing on, right? Especially coming back from the pandemic because it really depended. I've got a lot of students who had depended on what their parents were doing, if they were working on cutting and gluing and stuff with their children during the pandemic, or if
Hmm.
they weren't. So there's been, especially in like the last 2 years, has been kind of a big gap in
Hmm.
skills with students. So yeah, it's basically that. So like in preschool, preschool is a lot of stuff that's pre-cut.
Hmm.
I do a lot of in preschool, I do a lot of projects based on books, because that's always a good, so we'll read Pete the Cat, I love my white shoes, and then we'll make Pete the Cat, and all the pieces will be cut for them. And then it's more how they put it on to, how they put Pete together, and they'll be like upside down shoes and like
Yeah.
eyes by the whatever. Then when you move into kindergarten, now you're working on like this is how we hold our scissors the right way.
Okay.
And just a dot, not a lot of glue, like all of that stuff.
Hmm.
That's pretty much a lot of kindergarten. Paint and like introducing them to a lot of different materials, three-dimensional sculpture, we'll do like clay and everything, that sort of thing. And then first, second, and third is kind of you build on those skills.
Hmm.
So by the time you get to third grade, now you've got these skills, and now you're able to, like, my students just finished actually paper mosaics. So we learned about ancient Rome, right? And how,
Okay.
like, what how they were used, how mosaics were used. And
Hmm.
they looked at a lot of mosaics. And actually not just ancient Rome, they looked at mosaics from England and from
Okay.
all over Europe, really. And then they made the paper, one image in the middle, and then all the pieces of paper around it to
Hmm.
look like a mosaic. So that then with, like, once they've got those skills, then you can bring in kind of more of
Hmm.
the history of what it is that they're making.
Okay, and so with that, with their what kind of creative freedom do you allow for your students, and when do you decide there needs to be parameters
Yeah.
or so on their creativity?
Yeah, I would say I'm probably a little bit more I would say I've gotten a little bit looser as probably in 2012 I would have not let them pick any, not
Okay,
let them pick
interesting.
anything. I would
Okay.
say like for instance that mosaic project, they were able to pick the image.
Mhm.
Did I kind of encourage it to be, like a solid image,
Mhm.
something kind of easily it could easily be picked out, like a flower, or a lot of kids did letters, stuff like that. Yeah, but they were able to choose what it was.
Mhm.
um Trying to think of some other projects we've done. And you will always have some student who just really goes, like, left field. And sometimes those are like the best because
Mhm.
they just have a different way of looking at it. And it's really neat. I remember one kindergarten once we were drawing a house, and he like was flipping his paper over a bunch of times. And I didn't know what he was doing, because he was going inside and outside. Like one side was outside and one side was
Oh,
inside. I
wow.
was like, I
Okay.
didn't even think to do inside and outside, like, so you get that sometimes. So I feel like I give them sometimes they will be, it depends on what you're teaching. Like if you're teaching about, some of the littler kids, the color wheel, like you
Mhm.
can't really it has to be in the right order, right? It's got to
Mhm.
be in rainbow order, Roy G. Biv,
Right.
so that kind of thing. But what they choose to draw for those different colors, they can
Mhm.
choose to draw something. So, and then you have some students, I mean, there are some students who art is not, they want to have a very strict, like they
Mhm.
want to know exactly what you want from them.
Mhm.
They don't really want to like go, and, steer any clearer from,
Yeah.
away from that. So you
Think
do
I
have
was one
that
of those
sometimes.
kids.
Yeah. I kind of was too, I think. I was like, why aren't they painting that blue when she said to paint it blue? That kind of thing. So yeah, so I think I kind of I would say maybe again, um, coming back from the pandemic's been kind of a challenge. And so I have had to go back a little bit
Mhm.
and do projects that I may have done in sometimes I've switched the grade. So maybe if it was like a second grade project a couple of years ago, now it's third grade because I need to kind of build up that skill they may have
Mhm.
missed when they were remote. Um, so coming back, sometimes I have had to tighten it up a little bit more
Mhm.
and be a little bit more very clear with my expectations than maybe I would have
Mhm.
back in 2018, 2019,
Yeah.
when they had 4 solid years of being in my classroom.
Oh, yeah, building
Yeah,
that in-person
yeah,
connection.
yeah.
So when it comes to building these connections, when it comes to the way that you run your class and whether you interact with students and with your background as an art history teacher,
Mhm.
how do you connect social studies in history to art and how do you connect art to social studies and history?
Got you. Okay. Well, we do have so we're an international baccalaureate school, so we actually have units that we work on, and one of the
Okay.
units that I do is actually art around the world. So that one connects to I actually do have specific art genres or artists that they learn about.
Mhm.
So let's see, for instance, they do the first graders did like a pointillism painting and they learned about George Seurat and the little dots and everything.
Okay.
Um and it's hard like in that with when I'm trying to like talk about impressionism and stuff, it's I spend a lot of time trying to convey to the kids that what a mind-blowing thing impressionism was at the time, because that was a time when you didn't have a lot of photographs. You couldn't get your
Okay.
it was really expensive to get your photograph taken. So when they started kind of blurring all of, Monet and stuff started doing all this kind of like blurrier painting,
Mhm.
the salon in Paris was like, what are you, why isn't it, perfectly, like
Yeah.
everybody expected things to be perfect, right? So it was really just it blew everyone's mind when they
Mhm.
started making things, like the impression of something, not necessarily what it
Mm,
looked like in real
mhm.
life. And that's kind of a hard thing to kind of show them. But yeah, so that kind of thing I do. I sort of try to connect, things. Then another unit that we do is recycling to create, which is where we use all recyclable materials.
Okay.
And so that one we talk a lot about what you can do in your community to, save, help the environment, stuff
Mhm.
like that. Because I think in social studies, I think and I might be kind of dating myself, but I believe like is doesn't it go? It's like I feel like they still kind of follow that model. Like in preschool, it's like they talk about sort of like the classroom
Mhm.
community, right?
Yeah.
And then you build on the community, right? I believe then you're like my home community, my school community
Now I
as you
don't
go
wanna
up.
lie, 'cause I wanna teach high schoolers,
Okay.
so
Yeah.
I'm
That's a whole different, yeah, yeah. So I think that's how social studies is presented at the
Mhm.
beginning. And then you like kind of build up so that by the time you're in like those middle school grades, now you're learning about, the branches of government and stuff
Mhm.
like that. So we'll talk about what you can do in your community to help the environment,
Mhm.
stuff like that. We do try to sometimes have I try to talk about artists like from, the community too. I'll try
Mhm.
to do things like that. I'm trying to think now. I've completely forgot any of the ones I've taught,
That's
from this
okay,
from this
'cause
thing.
I do wanna go back to something that you said about your art all around the
Mhm,
world and kinda connecting that
mhm,
to the way that you're talking about preschoolers and the younger grades and how they
mhm.
build upon social studies
Yeah,
to reach the different levels that they get to.
mhm.
When the students are learning about art all around the world,
Mm.
how do they make connections between the different countries and the different continents and how the different art movements
Yeah.
impacted the culture?
It's a little difficult because, I mean, it's sort of hard to, they wouldn't necessarily have that much geography yet.
Mhm.
Um, but, I'll show them all sorts of like examples of, like, or maybe we'll tie it to like a holiday. Like I'll try to tie it like St. Patrick's Day.
Okay.
For instance, everybody just always makes like shamrocks and stuff and calls
Yeah,
it a day, but that's a huge holiday in Chicago that I feel like they should know about, right?
definitely.
And then also, but it's also based on, you know, uh, you know, Ireland. And so I kind of like try to bring, this is in this country. And sometimes I bring in, like that my family's from a different country or something like that. So you try to kind of like make connections to this, like their own lives. And sometimes they'll say, oh, I've been there, or if my family's from such and such, so you try to kind of make connections to it. Kids really understand a lot of stuff when you sort of try to like
definitely
bring it back to them, like what. So yeah, I try to kind of do that Chicago sort of like more of a local kind of flavor to some of that stuff, when you're teaching, that kind of thing. I'm trying to think of anything else. Mrs. Silk, the Spanish teacher, she will, when she's doing units on, she and I will always connect and do stuff on Frida Kahlo or Diego Rivera, or some of those artists, things like that. And then so they've got that connection from her and with me, so they kind of learn about them both. So we'll do stuff like that.
That's pretty interesting, because I just remember art being like, the only time where art was history or history was art was when it was Thanksgiving and we did the hand turkeys.
Yes.
And that's not even like
right.
factual.
Which I don't even, I will, like, sometimes I'll make it like on the last day, but it won't be like, I'll be like, okay, if you want the hand turkey, we'll do it, but that kind of thing. But I do try to kind of,
Oh, do they ask for the hand turkey?
Like parents sometimes will be like, oh, they didn't make a turkey, and as a parent, I actually do love my child, because it's like this teeny tiny hand now, right? That kind of thing. So yeah, I do sometimes, like I'll toss it in like right before Thanksgiving break, but yeah, I do actually. Another one that we did that was really fun with the third graders was we were learning paper weaving, which is way harder than anybody expects it to be. It's so hard. You remember making like a placemat probably around Thanksgiving, right? Where you just wove the paper in and out. Did you ever do that?
I don't.
Yeah, it's pretty basic, like a thing. And weaving is actually one of the skills like that. Where we teach, but just doing paper weaving just to make like a little placemat, I wasn't too interested in. So we actually were making African kente cloths.
Okay.
So we used kente cloth colors. They had to use specific colors, yellow, red. They learned about all the meanings behind all of the colors and stuff like that. And so they're paper weaving, and some of them even the ones who were, really good with cutting and everything, even like cut designs and like, zigzags and stuff like that to weave into the paper and everything. So yeah, I was like, and I'm not just going to make placemats. We're going to have this be pretty meaningful, and that actually kind of like went right into our international festival that we celebrate here. So yeah, we have those like African kente cloth.
So their art is a part of your international day.
Yeah.
Okay. That's beautiful. So this kind of makes me think about the next question that I want to ask you. And it's, how do you teach with your history, like like you're like super old. I mean, with your background in history and art, how do you teach preschoolers and through third graders the importance of learning about artists and the history of art in a way that they can digest, but in a way that doesn't say, oh, you're in preschool through third grade, so you don't understand what's going on?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think you have to bring it back to something that they might be working on, like in their classroom maybe, or something that's important to them. Like for for African American History Month, we made quilts based on the Gee's Bend quilts, which were these quilts that Gee's Bend was an area that Martin Luther King visited, and he told them to vote. And then when they voted, they actually like all of their jobs were taken away.
Wow.
When they crossed and so they started selling these quilts, and you can still buy them, and the families still make them.
Oh, where is that at?
At Gee's Bend, it's in is it in Alabama? I want to say it's in is it in Alabama? I want to say. And actually when so they stopped the ferry too. So they wouldn't let the people take the ferry to go vote. And so they used their like pack mules and everything, the Gee's Bend pack mules and everything to go to vote. And when Martin Luther King died, actually through Atlanta, his coffin was pulled by the Gee's Bend pack mules.
Wow.
From
Okay.
this whole, right? So we read a story on it, and then we looked at all of these quilts, and we made these like paper versions of the quilts, like all these designs. And actually, the students knew a lot about a lot of the stuff we were talking about because they'd studied it in class. Their family had talked to them about it, they actually, I mean, aside from the actual like Gee's Bend story, but they knew a lot about, Martin Luther King and that kind of a thing. So that was a pretty neat, they made a lot of connections. And at the time they were studying a bunch of things in class too. So they were able to kind of bring it all together into this project, which was very interesting. And actually one of our teachers, third grade teacher, actually knew some of the Gee's Bend quilters.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So she was able to like make that connection too. It was awesome. So, so I think kids absorb more than you think when
Definitely.
it comes to, and especially like this day and age with media and stuff, they have access to so much. So sometimes I'm actually blown away by how much they'll know about a subject that I didn't even know that they knew. Sometimes when you're studying with different countries, they'll have done, we all pick, each classroom picks different countries to study for international festivals. So sometimes they'll have known, oh, England, we did that last year, or, so Guatemala, we did that last year, Trinidad, that kind of thing. So you can make that connection that way too. So it's funny. They do actually make a lot of connections on their own. And sometimes they go and they study more. One girl, going back to that mosaic thing, one girl actually brought photos from, I think she went to, was it Jamaica or something, with her family, and there were mosaics at the hotel. She brought all these photographs of like the hotel. She's like, look at the mosaics.
What grade was she in?
Third.
Okay.
Yeah. She's like, I saw those when I was on vacation, like that kind of thing. So we were able to make that connection. So yeah, they do kind of bring that sort of stuff back to the classroom. And more than you think. I don't think people give little kids the benefit of the doubt.
Definitely.
A lot,
Cause my niece, she blows me away by the things that I learned from her
right
all the time.
Yeah.
But I want to take it back when you talked about, in order to teach the children, you have to make sure that it's in connection to what they know.
Yeah.
To what they can see. And a lot of the times I feel like when we're learning about art and when we're learning about history, it's so far away.
Yeah.
It's either far away in distance or it's far away in time.
Right.
And I know you talked a lot about local education when it comes to actually being in the city of Chicago. How are you connecting these? How are you connecting the art and the history of art, whether it be in distance or whether it be in time, to the Chicagoland area, whether it be right outside the school or whether it be downtown or Hyde Park, or whatever area that's in the city?
Well, that's a good point. Well, first of all, you have to give them the information about how they can experience art, right? Like when we did study the Impressionists, I actually told them, I said, guys, 2 miles away down Lakeshore Drive is the Art Institute, and it is filled with Impressionist paintings, including Sunday Afternoon on the Island of La Grande Jatte, George Seurat's painting that they were studying, right? So you have to you have to show them the opportunities where they can learn more about these things, because not every kid is going to museums every weekend with their parents to find these things out themselves, or they might not even know that information is there.
Yeah.
Sometimes I have to, take them, let's go back in time. Like the littler ones, I'll be like, let's close our eyes and we're going to go back in time.
Yeah.
Back to before your grandma was, which is funny because, they'll be like 1990, you're like,
that's
no,
so interesting.
1870, actually, like that kind of thing. No, hundreds of years ago, that kind of thing. So, you have to kind of make that connection. Sometimes when we do some of our experiences, like when we've gone to the Joffrey Ballet to do the Nutcracker, I sometimes
I love the Nutcracker.
Yeah. But they their newest version of the Nutcracker is based on it's set in like the Chicago World's Fair.
Okay.
So, we read a lot about that before we went, that kind of a thing. We'll do stuff like that. We drew pictures. I think that year, that was 2019. We drew posters, for World's Fair posters and stuff, and talked about that and, that kind of thing. So sometimes I'll try to put in some art projects that might be tying in with something they might be doing, like going to the Chicago History Museum, or going to the cultural, South Shore Cultural Center, wherever they might be going, to kind of this is what you might see. And when we talk about sculpture, we'll talk about, different statues around the
Mhm.
city and what, have you ever
Mm.
seen, and it's funny because they'll be like, oh yeah, because like, you walk past stuff all the time and don't even
Definitely, yeah.
realize, like, you just walked past a Picasso sculpture, you didn't even know it, like
Yeah,
that
I
kind of
still don't know
thing.
what any of these
Yeah,
sculptures
right,
are,
right.
honestly.
So I mean, you kind of try to, if you go downtown, you might see this, or you might,
Mhm.
that kind of thing. So I do try to kind of make connections to their world as much as I can, so yeah,
And I feel
I
like
feel like, am
you
I answering your question? I feel like I'm kind of
yes.
going around a lot,
No,
but yeah.
no,
Okay.
I feel like, every time, like, I answer questions, I'm always curious to see in the way that
Hmm.
everyone navigates that question, the
Yeah.
way that everyone navigates what I'm asking.
Yeah.
Because even when I was, like, teaching at a performance art summer camp,
Hmm.
I had the little ones, I had 7 and 8-year-olds.
Okay.
And even then, we're talking about emotions, and we're talking about dancing, and we're talking about
Hmm.
singing, and we're talking
Hmm.
about emotions.
Yeah.
But I'm also like, we're talking about, like, why is this stuff important? Why is the history of this important?
Hmm.
Because the lady who created the camp, Miss Marvinetta Penn, I absolutely love her. She was
Hmm.
great. She always talked about where did our people come from? Why is this important to who we
Hmm.
are? Why is it important for
Yeah.
Black little girls and Black children to
Hmm.
learn about their
Hmm.
history and learn about
Yeah.
emotions and learn about the history of why it's important to be in connection with each other
Hmm.
and live in art and live in love and be able to spread that in our community, especially because it's on the south side of Chicago. And if we think
Hmm.
about just the history of the south side of Chicago and we think
Yeah.
about the reputation of it,
Right.
sometimes it's not always the best. And everyone does not see the beautiful things in the
Right.
history that our kids are creating
Hmm.
right in the neighborhood.
Hmm.
And sometimes it's in little pockets where people can't see it. And we have to make sure that they're aware of
That
that and
they're
they
aware
know
and
that. And
yeah.
so I always like, and even though like that was like an educator position, I feel
Hmm.
like it was still a little bit more lax because it was a summer camp.
Yeah.
But I'm always just curious to hear how our teachers in the classroom full time
Yeah.
navigating what I only did in about a few months. And
Right.
even sometime it was like sped up because there was a performance that we had to
Right.
put on.
Right. Yeah.
So I'm just always curious how do I build upon this foundation that I dealt with seventh, eighth graders, 7, 8-year-olds,
Hmm.
and how am I going to start applying that when I become an educator and I'm,
Yeah.
trying to connect what I'm teaching with the different subjects such as art and social studies
Hmm.
and why
Hmm.
that's important to each other.
Yeah.
I feel like you touched on this question a little bit, but what are some misconceptions about preschoolers through third graders learning social studies and learning that through art?
I think definitely that the people think their world is really small, and I really
Mhm.
don't think it is. Like right now, my daughter's watching Bluey downstairs. She knows like all sorts of stuff about Australia just from
Wow.
watching that show, or she'll, like make connections like, why do they call this that, that kind of a
Mhm.
thing.
Mhm.
Um, the kids are like absorbing stuff a lot more than you think. And I think it really it happens when they're little. When
Mhm.
they're very little. Now, my mom is a preschool teacher, so I feel like
Okay.
I'm a little biased because I'm like the little ones are the biggest sponges, because but they really are, and they
Yeah.
really they know more than you think they know. I feel,
Mhm.
so I don't want them to get when they're in my room. Like I don't want them to think that I'm just like I don't want to like sit up there and just kind of like throw stuff at them. I do
Mhm.
want them to kind of ask me things and what they, how they feel about certain stuff that we're looking at and things like that. And they'll surprise you. They'll surprise always. We were doing a comparison for an art thing a critique that I had to do. And
Mhm.
the students were looking at a Bisa Butler quilt. She was just at the Art Institute a couple of years ago. She's an African American artist, amazing. She makes these quilts that like look like they're drawn. I mean, they're absolutely fantastic. So the students were comparing and contrasting one of her quilts to a Jacob Lawrence painting,
Mm,
and
mhm.
in both of those in both of the works of art, they were getting the one was called Broom Jumpers. The
Okay.
Bisa Butler quilt was called Broom Jumpers, and Jacob Lawrence painting was called The Wedding. And first grader was like, "Oh, broom jumper. That's another word for getting married." She knew exactly what I was talking about. I didn't even offer that. I hadn't even offered that information to them yet to
Mhm.
explain that was, that's basically a tradition from, and I went and explained all of it, and she knew it. She explained it back to me. She's in first
Mm.
grade.
Mhm.
She knew exactly what that was. Oh yeah, they would jump the broom because back when they were, when they were slaves, they couldn't what did she say? She said that they couldn't actually get married. So they would jump over the broom instead. She said that to me. I was like blown away. And explained it to the class. And she has a 6 and 7-year-old, you know? So, I mean, they absorb more than you think. Then,
Definitely.
yeah, you'd be surprised at how much they would know about some sort of subject, sometimes more than I do, you know? So yeah, that was a really awesome connection that she made. So yeah, so I feel like that's the biggest misconception. I feel like people, and I do teach. I mean, I am teaching kids not to put glue all over their paper. That's a big part of my job, right? But I think making things meaningful is a lot easier than teachers might necessarily think, you know, or people might necessarily think that aren't teachers.
Yeah, I know you said like you leave space for your students to ask questions and for them to express what they know.
Yeah.
How do you create that space for them to feel comfortable even being able to ask those questions and being able to express what they know?
Well, we do have, and I'm sorry, it's like the end of the year, so I feel like I'm losing all of my adjectives and
I promise I get you out of here.
Yeah.
About like 1 or 2 questions and we're gonna get out of here.
But when we do like critiques and stuff, or when we're talking about things, I follow this, it's an acronym that called THINK. And it's like, it says, you have to think to yourself, is it helpful? Is it kind? Is it necessary? Is it, I can't remember.
I think I've seen that poster in a few
think,
rooms.
like before you speak, think, like, is this relevant? Is it helpful? Is the H? Is it, I can't remember what the I is it, the N is, I think, is it necessary? Is it necessary when you're like speaking about somebody else's work, something, and then is it kind? So we kind of have these like parameters of what, like, you know, okay, if you're going to ask a question, like, this is like, how are you going to, you know, you have to kind of model that at the beginning of the year. You know, and they're pretty good at that. Especially like the little ones do a lot of work like in groups and stuff. So they're pretty good at that dynamic of asking questions and, you know, being respectful of other students' questions and stuff. Sentence start, you know, they learn like the sentence, like, piggybacking on what so-and-so said, you know, they'll say stuff like that, you know? So yeah, you do have to kind of create like a respectful environment for them to ask those questions, you know? So yeah, you kind of have to you do have to sort of lead them along, maybe more than a, you know, a middle school or a high school teacher would. But yeah, you can get those conversations from them, you know, and have them be pretty relevant. Yeah. So, and they'll remember stuff from other years too. Like they'll remember doing something the year before and kind of pepper in some information about that too, you know?
And what do you think is the importance of preschoolers and third graders learning about art and learning about history? Because I feel like sometimes when we're thinking about young kids, we're thinking, oh, we need to protect them from this, or we need to censor that.
Yeah.
And sometimes can that be harmful to not allow them to be able to explore and being able to trust them and the way that you trust them and learning from them?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's, you know, I mean, you do have to kind of be, you know, you don't want, you know, you don't want a parent coming the next day and saying like, you taught my child what, you know, like Frida Kahlo is sort of, you have to sort of tread lightly with her work, right? Because it gets pretty not safe for students very fast, you know? So I wouldn't necessarily say, she had an exhibit of her, photographs and stuff that she would take, was at the National Museum of Mexican Heritage in Pilsen. And I went over the summer and it was still open at the beginning of the year, but I was like, I don't think I will be I don't think I'll be recommending this to any of my students to go to, because there were some, you know, rough things in there, you know, so you do have to you have to tread lightly, you know, and you know, sometimes kids will say, you know, they'll say stuff that kind of catches you off guard, and you have to sort of say, you know, maybe that's something you could talk about with your parents, you know, but you can say, you know, why do you think it was hard for, you know, why do you think it was hard for this artist at that time to do this, you know, something like that. And how would you feel if you were told you couldn't do, you know, I'll frame it like that a lot of times. Cause like the fauve artists, those were like the kind of like branch off of the Impressionists that were like really, Matisse was one of them and stuff. And they just use like these like blocks of color, and fauve actually means wild beast, because they like, yeah, when they show their stuff, people are like, what is what, you know, they just, you know, and I was like, how would you feel if somebody, you know, told you you can only paint this way, you can only do something this way?
Mhm.
How would that make you feel? And so you kind of bring it back to that, and they kind of, you know, that would make me feel I should be able to do what I want to do, you know, that kind of
Yeah.
thing. So you're able to kind of bring it back to them in that way. um yeah, so you do have to, like, with art, you do have to be kind of be careful, you know, that you don't expose them to something that they,
Mhm.
you know, can't really see, you know, even like the mosaics and stuff. I had to be very careful,
Mhm.
very curated curated slideshows and things like that, you
Okay.
know,
Yeah.
because you don't want to like totally, you know, destroy their worldview, you know.
Of course, of course.
But I mean, the, you know, school is where you will learn some tough things. When I, you
Mhm.
know, when I was in 5th grade, my teacher read us Lois Lowry's Number of the Stars, and I was like,
Mhm.
what is, yeah, and I was like,
Mhm.
Mom, Dad, what is the Holocaust? And my parents were like, oh, you know,
Yeah.
they just my mom says later, she's like, we just, it's not that we were keeping it from you, but we just didn't, you know, really want to go into the, you know,
Mhm.
that kind of thing. But that was something I learned at school and came home and was like, what happened here, you know? Um, so, you know, you kind of have to, you plant the seeds, but you do sometimes have to, you know, let them kind of explore that more on their own,
Mhm.
you know, in the way that their parents think might be
Mhm.
appropriate, you know?
And, the last little thing that I wanna ask is,
Hmm.
when it comes to art, when it comes to art history, how do you think it's helping push students along within their social studies classes? Because I know there are studies about how art is important to the development of their
Hmm.
classes and development with everything else. So, what is the importance of that, and what does that look like when they're moving on in the higher grades to their social studies classes and other classes in
Hmm.
connection to social studies?
Um, Probably that, you know, that art is, you know, I mean, I feel like art, well, first of all, I feel like art is like just important in general for students to, you know, there's so many skills that you have to learn, you know, find, I do, I'll sometimes sit in on like, you know, IEP meetings for students and
Mhm,
stuff.
mhm,
And the occupational therapist will basically, she and I basically talk about the exact same things, like holding, you know, holding scissors the right way and stuff like that, you know. So there's so many skills that you're learning in art
mhm,
class, how to look at things, how to approach things,
mhm,
problem solving and stuff, you know. Um, and I feel, I mean, and you probably would know this too, sort of as you get older, you know, history gets, history classes some tend to get a little bit drier as you
yeah,
go, you know, because there's, you know, certain things you have to have, you know, I was in AP history. And so
mhm,
you had to know the things that were going to be on that AP history test, right?
mhm,
You know, that kind of thing. Um, but, you know, I think that, you know, art has always, you know, another one that I learned about actually when I was young was, because it was actually kind of going on, or it was sort of in the tail end, but like the you know, the AIDS movement was
mhm,
sort of happening when I was in grade school.
okay,
And I learned about Keith Haring, you know, at that
mhm,
time from my art teacher. That's like a
mhm,
memory I remember because he was that, and I'm really dating myself because it's like 1988. But you know, because he came to Chicago and did a mural with the Chicago public schools high
mhm.
school
Oh,
students.
wow, okay.
Yeah, like he actually did a mural with them, and it was on display at the Chicago cultural museum, culture, what is it, downstairs, the one right on Michigan Avenue, for a while. But yeah, and but I was learning about that because we were learning about the impact of, like, you know, AIDS that was sort of like happening in the news at that time.
Mhm,
So our teachers were, you know, they were open to ask, you know, asking us what, you know, we thought of that, and we were reading about it in those little Time, you know, little
yeah,
Time magazine things and everything. It was a big deal. And a lot of those artists from that time were very relevant to that. You
mhm,
know, they either died from AIDS, or, you know, like Keith Haring, or, you know, they were involved in that whole movement,
mhm,
you know. So, I mean, I think that art is, it's a way to express yourself.
yeah,
And like when you can't, you know, when something's happening in the world, that's what you have to express
yeah,
yourself somehow, you know. So I mean, I think that's, and it goes back to, like, you know, sometimes we did like cave paintings in 3rd grade where we pretended to make, you know, and we talk about, you know, even the ones, those the Alaska where they just have like the handprint, like
mhm,
somebody just thought that was like important to like put their hand on that you know, that cave wall, you know.
mhm,
So we've needed this, we've needed to express ourselves for millennia, right?
yeah,
So I mean, I that's why I think art is so important, because you have to express yourself somehow, right?
yes, and
Yeah.
when I was in high school, I always had a very fortunate experience learning
Mhm.
social studies and learning history. But my junior year, I had a class. It was history through the African American lens. It was a way longer name than that,
Mhm.
but I can't remember the
That
whole
was it,
thing.
yeah.
But that class opened my eyes to so much, and I was actually like, I write poetry, and
Mhm.
I've been writing poetry since like 8th grade,
Mhm.
but I didn't start honing in my skills until like my sophomore year in
Mhm.
high school.
Mhm.
And when I took that class, I was able to take the facts that he learned and I
Mhm.
was able to start doing spoken word. Because at first I
Mhm.
wasn't doing spoken word, I was just
Mhm.
writing on paper,
Mhm.
but I was able to take my words on paper, find what I felt in my heart and my mind, and from what he taught, what he learned, my history, what does that mean for me?
Mhm.
And I was able to perform at like different assemblies at school, and all my classmates was like, I was crying because I'm like,
Mhm.
dang, like what we're learning in class, like who we're learning, like who we are then and who we are now, and
Mhm.
what that's gonna look like for us in the future. You were able
Mhm.
to put that in a whole performance piece. And
Right.
I'm like, yeah, because our teacher, shout out Mr. Smith,
Mhm.
he gave us the freedom to be able to express ourselves in that way. I just wanna say thank you so much
Oh,
because
yes.
I love art, and I used to absolutely be terrified of it, and, like, when I was in high school, I remember, like, when I first had to go into art, I cried to my grandma, I'm like, "I'm gonna fail this class, I'm gonna be the first time I don't get an A," and I got an A in that class, and I was like, I absolutely loved it. I
Oh,
love
good.
talking about art and history because
Yeah.
a lot of the times I feel like people try to separate
Mhm.
those subjects and try to make it seem like one might be less or one might be more
Right.
important than the other, but before we end, I
Mhm.
always like to ask people,
Mhm.
drop that knowledge, drop some knowledge. What is that one thing that you want the people to take with you? You dropped a lot, but just
Yeah.
that one or two things that you want everyone to take with them.
With them about art in general or
Art history in
about
general.
art history?
What does that look like in a classroom for their students to be safer in their classroom,
Mhm.
for the teachers to be safer in their classroom, and for them to thrive through art and history?
Um, I think they always need to be questioning why somebody made something.
Mhm.
I think that's one thing about art that people who aren't into art might not necessarily, they'll look at a Jackson Pollock or something like, "Ugh," you know. So if you don't know that why he made those,
Mhm.
then you don't understand, you don't understand that piece of art.
Mhm.
So that's, I think, why I got so into art history was because you'd look at all of these, paintings downtown, even the Renaissance paintings and
Yeah.
stuff, like, they all had there was a reason, and it wasn't always just because some rich person was commissioning you to do them, right?
Yeah.
Or even better, when some of those Renaissance artists would kind of like put in, something sort of like something a little bit that, like, maybe they thought that the person that was commissioning it wouldn't see, some kind
Mhm.
of like, um political thing or something that they kind
Mhm.
of would sneak in through the art, that kind of thing. So art has, like, any piece of art has a reason to it. And I
Mhm.
think if you don't know that, then I don't think you will really understand why people even make art. So
Mm.
that's why I think it's so important to know about the artists and know why they were doing something. That Keith Haring mural it was so moving when I saw it in person because it was so full of life. And I
Mhm.
think he was dead maybe like 6 months after,
Mm.
or a year after he came to Chicago to make
Mhm.
that. So I feel like you could see that he was losing time. He
Mhm.
was losing time
Mhm.
before he died. And so I just thought it was amazing that he, like, asked these kids what was important to them. Let's put it into this big mural, had them help him and paint it. And, it was this amazing experience. And you can still feel that relevance
Mhm.
now. So, and I feel like maybe if I could even convey like a little bit of that, how I feel about art that way to my students, then I've done a good job, that they feel that what they're making and what they're looking at is
Mhm.
meaningful.
That was, oh my god, that's so
Is that a
beautiful. That just makes me think about all of the pictures, the paintings that are around
Mhm.
my house. Like,
Mhm.
I've been surrounded by art my whole life.
Yep.
I've been surrounded by the beauty of art
Mhm.
and the meaning of art my whole life.
Yeah.
So that was beautiful. I think what I would want everyone to take is allow your students the freedom to express their
Mhm.
creativity, allow them the space to be able to expand upon their knowledge and be able to connect the distance in time, the difference in places to where they are in the present, to be
Mhm.
able to connect them to the history that is everywhere, so
Mhm.
that way they understand that there is art and there is beauty in history and everything.
Yep.
Thank you so
You're
much
welcome. Thank you
again
for
for
having me.
joining me. I truly enjoy speaking with you. And that concludes another episode of What's Going On, the Social Studies Network podcast. Peace.